Hi, I'm Jim Denison with Denison Forum. I'm here today with Greg Baylor of the Alliance Defending Freedom. So grateful to Greg for his time, for his willingness to have this conversation with me. We're here to talk about what I think may be the most significant threat to religious liberty in American history, and an issue I'm wanting everybody with whom we have any influence to know about and be responding to. And with Greg's remarkable legislative and legal perspective and expertise on this, he is an incredible resource for us in this conversation. So first of all, Greg, thank you for your time, your willingness to be in this conversation. Would you begin by telling us a little about ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, who you are and what you do?
Sure. ADF, or Alliance Defending Freedom, is a legal ministry, a Christian legal ministry that's dedicated to keeping the doors open for the spread of the gospel. And we pursue that objective in a variety of ways. We're first and foremost an advocacy organization. We participate in test case litigation designed to set good precedents that will protect the religious liberty not only of our clients, but of the church and really every person of faith as a whole. We also have a significant legislative activity presence, governmental affairs activities. That's part of the thing that I do at ADF. We're working not only in the states, but at the federal level as well, both in Congress and in the federal agencies, trying to protect religious liberty, the sanctity of life, and marriage and the family. Finally, we have a really significant kind of training programs, I should say. We have a program that's for lawyers who are already out in practice, our allied attorney program. We have thousands and thousands of allied attorneys who've come alongside ADF in the 25 years that it's been in existence. We also have a training program for law students, the Blackstone Fellowship. It's kind of a combination of classroom learning and practical experience, where in a summer, in between their first and second year of law school, law students have a chance to work, perhaps in an ADF office, perhaps at the office of an allied organization or an allied attorney, doing the kind of work that ADF is focused on, which again is religious liberty, sanctity of life, marriage, and the family. And finally, we have a training program for college students called Arete, which is a little bit more compressed. But we think it's important for folks not just to do the advocacy, but to understand the foundations of why we do our advocacy and how it's rooted in and consistent with our faith.
Thank you so much for that, Greg. Tell them a little bit, if you would, about yourself, about your background and what you do specifically at ADF.
Yeah, well, I graduated from law school in 1990, and I wasn't a believer at that point in time, but I became one soon thereafter. And I was really confused about what I should do with my life. I mean, my perspective had changed, my worldview had changed. And I was looking about for something, right, that I could combine my minimal amount of legal experience and my law school experience with my newfound faith. And this is back in the days of the early 90s when there really wasn't much of an internet to speak of, and it was just hard to find things. And ADF hadn't really come into existence yet at that point. But I did eventually hook up with Christian Legal Society and its Center for Law and Religious Freedom, which ended up being a place where I worked for 15 years and got to know Alliance Defending Freedom. We sort of grew up together, as it were. ADF was launched in the beginning of 1994. I started doing this sort of work after work at firms and a judicial clerkship in September of 1994. And really, ADF was right there at the beginning. They were a convener of the disparate groups that were doing this kind of work, including Christian Legal Society. They were a funder. They raised funds and dispensed it out to organizations like CLS, enabling us to do the work of religious freedom, sanctity, life, marriage, and the family. And I had lots of interactions with ADF over time, very profitable and productive and wonderful relationships and projects together. And so when it came time to move on, it was perhaps the most seamless change you could imagine. And I've been blessed to be part of ADF since for about 11 and a half years now. I have a couple of roles. One of them is to do legislative advocacy, as I mentioned before, that I'm a part of, mostly in the federal system, mostly about issues involving sexual orientation and gender identity, things like the Equality Act. But my other niche and my other hat is serving as the director of ADF's Center for Religious Schools. Do a lot of work on behalf of liberal arts universities, but it's really the whole gamut from pre-K to seminary, and just serving the religious liberty needs of those institutions, defending the threats that they're facing, which are many these days. So it's a great joy to have become part of that Christian higher ed world and Christian educational world. And it's one of the joys of my life to be able to do that. And I'm glad that ADF is the place that I can do it at.
And do it well. For those that wouldn't know, got to watch Greg at work not long ago. He and I were together consulting with a Christian university that was wanting to know more about the Equality Act and how they could respond to it. So they asked me to come in and talk about it from a cultural, historical perspective. Another individual looked at it from an educational perspective, and Greg was the legal expert on the call. And it was in that conversation, watching him discuss this, describe this, explain it, explain the threat, explain what we can do about it, that I thought I really would like our listeners, our viewers to be able to have exposure to this information as well. And that's how we met and how we came to this place right now, to watch Greg do what he just said he does. And really grateful to you for your willingness to do this, the ministry that God has given you in doing this. So let me ask you first, if you would, simply to define for our listeners, our viewers, what the Equality Act is and why it is such a threat.
Yep. The simplest way to think about the Equality Act is this. It's a proposal, it's a bill that would add sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes in a number of existing federal non-discrimination laws. Let's talk about those existing laws. What does the federal government make illegal when it comes to discrimination? Well, with respect to so-called places of public accommodation, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. Well, what's a place of public accommodation? Well, that definition stems from one of the historical realities that motivated the Civil Rights Act of 1964. At that time in our country's history, it was often very difficult for African Americans to travel, particularly travel interstate, when they would need to stay at hotels and get a meal at a restaurant. And too many of those entities were turning people away simply because of the color of their skin. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was this piece of it, Title II, was a response to that problem. And the interesting thing about that is that they defined what's a place of public accommodation rather narrowly. So if you look at the definition in the statute, it says things like hotels and restaurants and movie theaters and stadiums and things like that. It was kind of targeted to what the problem was. What does the Equality Act do to change that? Well, as I said a minute ago, it does what it does to all of these non-discrimination laws, which is to add sexual orientation, gender identity, or SOGI, as protected classes. But perhaps just as significantly, it really dramatically expands the coverage of this aspect of the civil rights law. It expands the definition of what counts as a place of public accommodation. Whereas before it was hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, stadiums, things like that, it's now almost everything. I mean, the language of the statute, of the proposal rather, the bill, says it's any establishment that provides a good, a service, or a program. I mean, it's almost easier to think of the things that don't do that than the things that do that. And I think importantly, the drafters of the bill signaled their desire to cover nonprofit social service ministries for the first time. They have a non-exhaustive list of things that count as places of public accommodation. And one of them is a food bank and one of them is a shelter. So, they really want broad coverage. So that's one piece of it. What are the other existing federal non-discrimination laws that the Equality Act would amend, that would add SOGI to? Employment, housing, and recipients of federal financial assistance. That last one is incredibly consequential. Think about all of the entities in our country that get money either directly or indirectly from the federal government. Every public school in the United States, almost every institution of higher education, whether public or private, religious or secular, a lot of social service ministries, to the homeless, to the addicted, are funded in part by the federal government. Right now, there is a non-discrimination string or condition that attaches itself to all of that money, but those strings aren't problematic. They tell Christian colleges not to discriminate on the basis of race, color, national. Well, they don't do that, right? So it's not a problem for them to sign on the dotted line and say, yeah, we'll take the student aid that's flowing through our students and we won't discriminate on those bases. But when you add sexual orientation and gender identity, to the list of protected classes if it does become problematic. Two other quick things about the Equality Act, and then maybe we can talk about its real life consequences. No religious exemptions, none at all. One of the interesting things, if you look back at sexual orientation, gender identity, non-discrimination laws that have been adopted by the states and localities over the last 25 years, at least especially at the beginning of that process, a lot of them had very robust religious exemptions, partly because it was a political necessity at that time. The Equality Act, nothing. No religious exemptions. Really, it shows just, I think, how aggressive and how radical this bill is. But it gets even worse than that. And this is the last thing I'll say about it. Is that it deprives people of faith, institutions of faith, of their primary ability, legal ability to protect themselves with resort to religious liberty law. The best protection we have in federal law right now from the federal government when it's trying to violate our religious liberty is not the First Amendment, believe it or not. It's not the Free Exercise Clause. It's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a statute that was passed by tremendously bipartisan majorities, signed by President Bill Clinton in 1993. But the Equality Act says, look, we know that you people are going to use that to defend yourselves from the Equality Act and some of its worst manifestations. And we don't want you to be able to do that. So the Equality Act says you cannot invoke the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to defend yourself. So very aggressive, very comprehensive, and very disrespectful of religious liberty.
Yeah, Greg, thank you for that so much. Let me add very briefly, I've said this in other things I've written on and spoken on in this regard. Those that are watching or hearing this right now might be thinking, well, surely that's an oversight. Surely that's something that could be restored, as has been the case in the past. Surely we can stand up for this and we can come to some accommodation. It's important to understand that, as Greg just said, this is very intentional. This is very deliberate on the part of those that have created this act. And the reason it is that way is many of them anyway, see, let's say evangelicals, for instance, our position on LGBTQ acts or discriminations, they would say, as being as bigoted and prejudiced as if we were doing this relative to racial minorities. They look at us through the same lens as we would look at the KKK. They would say that if, for instance, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but if, for instance, a faith-based hospital doesn't wish to do a gender transition surgery, they would see that as being as discriminatory as if that hospital wasn't willing to operate on an African American or an Asian American. They would see a church that doesn't want to do a same-sex wedding as being just as discriminatory as if they weren't willing to do a Hispanic wedding. And just like you wouldn't want somebody in the KKK to be able to cite religious freedom to give them coverage for their discrimination, they expressly don't want us to be able to cite religious freedom to cover what they think is our prejudice or homophobia or discrimination or whatever. So this is part of a larger trajectory in the culture that for a long time now has come to see religion in general and evangelical Christianity in specific as really dangerous to the culture, as bigoted and prejudiced and discriminatory and all that. So it's a very intentional move on their part. It's not going to be something that's simply brought to attention and gotten to and compromised. It's really part of the reason why the Equality Act exists. We could talk about this down the way, but parts of what the Equality Act is trying to do have already been done, like with Bostock and others might be able to be done in piecemeal. But this is being done in a holistic way, as much because of the desire to exempt religious freedom from this as maybe anything else. And so this is a major foundational part of the Equality Act, is what we're saying here. We're not crying wolf. We're not doing religious hyperbole here. We're not being alarmists. We're citing what those that have framed this and are advocating it are absolutely saying about it. And I think that's an important point for us to understand. So as we move on, Greg, let me ask you then, if you would, to talk about some of the specific applications of the Equality Act to organizations that some of those watching or hearing this might be a part of.
Yeah. We talked about all sort of the legal changes that it makes, but I think what's more important than that is the actual consequences of this were to become law. And I think you're right to sound the alarm. I think all too many people overlook the drasticness of this and the incredible negative impact that it'll have, not on just on religious liberty, but on the common good as well. Right. I mentioned in our opening part of our conversation about how one of my specialties or focus areas is religious educational institutions. What would the Equality Act do to them? 2 words: punish and defund. Punish and defund. I think it's highly likely that religious educational institutions, the Christian schools that you send your kids to, or the Christian college that you might have graduated from, that their practices will become illegal, not just unfunded, not just in a way that you can avoid the problem by giving up any federal support that you might receive, but just outright illegal. That's a consequence of the Equality Act amending Title II, which just forbids discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say you can't discriminate if you get money. It just says no discrimination. Well, what does that mean for a Christian school? I mean, yeah, Christian schools aren't discriminating against people in an unjust way, in my opinion, but in the opinion of the supporters of the Equality Act, they are. And some of the ways that they would point at would be, say, you have an admissions requirement. You want one or both parents to be professing believers, or you have conduct standards that say students can't engage in a whole variety of activity that's sinful, including but not limited to homosexual behavior or as presenting as the opposite sex. Policies like those would be in jeopardy. I think it's pretty clear that they would be illegal under the Equality Act. The interesting thing, too, about the Equality Act, because it expands what counts as a place of public accommodation, perhaps to reach schools, religion is already a protected classification there. That's not been a problem in the past for schools because they've never been public accommodations. Under this law, they probably would be. What does that mean? You can't have like a statement of faith requirement. The curriculum might be deemed to be a hostile creation of a hostile environment. At the college level, this was the defund part comes into effect. All that student aid that flows to students who want the freedom to choose among all of their options, they want to choose to go to Wheaton or Hardin-Simmons or Biola or any school like that, that has traditional beliefs about marriage, the distinction between the sexes, sexual morality, and they have policies that reflect that, their freedom would be taken away. They would say, hey, if you want to get this money, you can't pick that school. So tremendous negative impact on educational institutions. What about the healthcare context? I think medical providers are clearly going to be public accommodations. And as we all know, the federal government funds a lot of healthcare in this country. So the combined effect of that prohibition and that non-discrimination string, what does that mean for healthcare? I think it means bad things for medical conscience rights. And I think it means bad things for young people who are suffering or struggling with their gender identity. First of all, the doctors. The supporters of the bill have said, like, if you perform a mastectomy to treat breast cancer, you will be required to perform so-called top surgery in a female's effort to transform themselves into the appearance of a man. In other words, sex reassignment surgery. If you are an endocrinologist who prescribes puberty blockers for a condition called precocious puberty, where kids start going through puberty too early, that's considered a medical condition that needs to be treated. If you do that, then you got to prescribe puberty blockers for a 12-year-old who thinks they might be the opposite sex, disregarding your conscience, and the medical evidence suggests that this is probably not a good idea. You could be compelled to perform sex reassignment surgery, to inject cross-sex hormones. So tremendous impact on the patients who are getting what I would consider to be bad medicine, and that's just not my opinion. I'm relying on the doctors for that proposition, and it would have an effect on conscience. How about privacy and safety? Non-discrimination rules, gender identity non-discrimination rules have been interpreted to mean that entities that are covered by those rules must allow men who identify as women to have access to private spaces. We represented a client who was facing a charge under a local ordinance in Anchorage that was similar, almost identical to the Equality Act, no gender identity discrimination. They were confronted with a situation, they being a women's shelter for women. Now, they serve men during the day, but their overnight shelter sleeping facility is reserved for women. They had a man show up, man identifies as a woman, he's intoxicated, injured, and he demands access to this communal sleeping space where the cots are like 3-5 feet apart. And they, respectfully turn him away. They offer to take him to the hospital, to a men's clinic. He doesn't accept any of that, but he does get a lawyer and sue them under something analogous to the Equality Act. He's trying to force his way into this women-only private space. Now, think about the women who are in this shelter. Many of them are victims of domestic abuse. Many of the victims are of sexual violence. Many have been raped, sex trafficking. One of them testified in the course of the case that she said, I would rather sleep outside under a bridge in the Alaskan winter than have a biological man in this space with me. The Equality Act would require women's shelters to allow biological men in. And then, of course, the whole sports issue that we've been hearing about so often, the problems that have been isolated, like in Connecticut with the track runners, that would be proliferate across the country. So a lot of negative practical consequences of the Equality Act.
Talk about the Connecticut track runners for just a moment as just an example, because we're often hearing people say this is not an issue, this is not a thing, that if biological males transition to being females with all of the hormonal changes and all that, they won't have any unfair advantages from a physical perspective. And really, we're just kind of crying wolf here. And so use Connecticut as an example of why that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, the science just doesn't support that proposition. But this is what Connecticut did. Their Interscholastic Athletic Association said, you know what, we're not going to have discrimination against transgender people. But they interpreted that so broadly as to mean, look, if you identify as the opposite sex, you get to participate in their events. And obviously, that's way more problematic when boys are participating rather in girls' events. And there were two young men, track athletes, frankly, not to disparage them, but they were mediocre male track athletes. And they both decided to start identifying as female. And under this policy that the Athletic Association had adopted, they had a right to participate in women's sports. Now, it just so happens that this entity didn't require any kind of you have to be on testosterone suppressants for a certain amount of time. Your testosterone levels have to be at a certain level before you can compete. That's the policy that some other entities use, but they didn't even have that. Mm-hmm. So these two boys come in and compete, and it was tragic for the girls who are used to having a chance of winning. They get up to the line and they understand that they've got no shot and that they're not going to be on the podium. Well, maybe they'll get a bronze. That's the best that they can do. And these two men won, I think, 15 out of 18 state championships. They deprived female runners of about 85 opportunities to advance to higher. I mean, track is very competitive at this level, and it matters for your life in the sense that this is, if you succeed, you can get a college scholarship and go to a great school and have them pay for it. These opportunities are being deprived. And by the way, the science, as I implied earlier, doesn't support the proposition that if you suppress testosterone for a while, everything is going to be fine. There was a study released out of Britain in December of 2020 that decimated that argument. It's just an inescapable fact, whether we like it or not, that with respect to some sports, especially the ones that involve strength and speed and jumping, that males have an advantage that can't be eradicated by testosterone suppression. So again, the point of that story is, yes, it was unfair and tragic for these girls in Connecticut, and a lot of states are responding to this, but the federal government would wipe all of that away if it adopted the Equality Act.
And so all that to say, this is a real and present issue. Let's come back, if we would, to the point you made a little bit ago as regards this being illegal. A lot of folk are hearing this, at least in the conversations I'm in, Greg, and they're thinking, well, my church doesn't receive federal funds, or my school doesn't receive that much, or we could give that up if we had to. If it's a funding issue, there's a lot of voluntary issues inside this. We'll talk about in a moment, NCAA, other groups like that. But I think I could even live with that. I could just live in a world, kind of live and let live in this kind of space. So let's go back and make that point again. What we're talking about, if Equality Act passed as it is now, those positions would not just be unfundable, they would be illegal. And what happens on the other side of that, if you'd return to that very quickly?
Sure. That's exactly right. I mean, I work with a lot of Christian colleges, and we should have a plan to make ourselves free of government money, like Hillsdale or Grove City. Mm-hmm. And I tell them, that's all well and good, but you can't escape so-called police power laws that apply to you, not because you get money, but because you're here. You're in the jurisdiction of the United States. Title II, public accommodations. Title VII is about employment. The Fair Housing Act. All of those are just rules that apply. And, when you violate one of those laws, or at least you've been accused of violating one of those laws, you go into court and you have a case. And suppose the other side wins. Here's what they can ask for. They can ask for monetary damages, compensatory damages. You fired me from my job and I was unemployed for 6 months. Therefore, you owe me this amount. You can get, punitive damages. You're a bad actor and you need to be punished above and beyond the actual calculable damages that you cause. And the other thing that they ask is injunctive relief. It's like not only do you have to pay, but you have to do stuff. You have to, for example, rehire this person, or you have to change your policies. You have to stop saying in your advertisements that you want believing Christians who follow the Bible's teachings on sexuality issues. So that they're just telling you not to do things, or they're forcing you to do. This is what judges can do, and they usually do it at the end of a case that's not so much about money. Now, here's the thing. What if you said, I'm not going to do that? I refuse to do that. I'm a Christian school and I'm not going to change my admission standards. At the end of the day, you could go to jail for that refusal, because when you disobey an injunction, the penalty can be, and often is, you're in contempt of court and you're going to jail. Well, that's how they get people to obey the judges at the end of the day. Or the marshals will come and take your stuff if you won't pay like a judgment or something like that. So it's not as though these are criminal laws that have criminal penalties, but do you really care if you're in jail because of your lack of compliance, whether, oh, well, this is not a criminal offense, it's just a sin. It's the way judges enforce judgments and enforce their injunctions. So jail time is on the table as a consequence of the Equality Act.
And as you're thinking about that, again, if you're involved with a school or religious organization, it's the whole gamut. It's same-sex couples wanting to use your accommodations, your housing. It's transgender athletes. It's transgender private spaces, showers and locker rooms and restrooms. It even goes to curriculum, as Greg said before. It goes to what you teach in the classroom. It goes to how you govern. Again, if I could go back and talk about the earlier kind of prism, if you were wanting to espouse as a school or as a church or as a hospital, a KKK kind of horrific sort of racial discrimination, well, the government would have a right to come in and say, you're not allowed to do that. You can't do that. And we would want that not to be the case, right? We wouldn't want the KKK able to burn crosses in front yards and all of that. That's exactly how those that are on the other side of this look at Christians who are claiming religious exemption to, they would say, discriminate. The right to be wrong is what they're looking at here. And this is on that level of severity. That's why we keep saying it's the greatest threat, not only to religious liberty, but you could say to free exercise of religion in American history. We've never been here before. We have never seen anyone try to do this on this level. It just simply hasn't happened. And that's why we're trying to be so adamant about wanting people to know about this and respond to it. Greg, in a moment, I'd like to ask you to tell us what we can do on practical levels about that. Yeah. But some are hearing about a thing called the Fairness for All Act as maybe a substitute for this, or a compromise, or a way that perhaps the Senate could go instead of this. If you would very briefly just describe what that is, and then tell us about the plausibility of that as an alternative to the Equality Act in the real world of politics today.
Sure. We like to refer to Fairness for All as Equality Act light. I mean, at the end of the day, it is a SOGI. It is a law that adds sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes to a number of existing federal non-discrimination laws, just like the Equality Act. Title II, public accommodations, Title VI, recipients of federal money, Title VII, employment, the Fair Housing Act. The Fairness for All proposal does exactly the same things as the Equality Act. What's different about it? Well, it has some religious exemptions and carve-outs in it, and it doesn't take away the RFRA defense. Those are good things. I'm not saying that Fairness for All is worse or as bad as the Equality Act. It's not. It's slightly better, but it's not that great, and it's highly implausible. Let's talk about its plausibility first. The whole idea behind the Fairness for All proposal was that if political conservatives and people of faith, evangelicals, traditional Catholics, if they take a step forward and say, hey, folks who are normally on the other side of this, the LGBT activist organizations, we are willing to give you something that you want, which is the addition of sexual orientation, gender identity to all these classifications. The idea was that if that happened, the other side, as it were, would respond in kind and say, okay, what's your price for that? The price is religious exemptions. And the idea is they would be willing to accept religious exemptions and carve-outs. That premise has been proven false. It just didn't happen that way. Now, I think one could have predicted that, but maybe you can't fault folks for trying.
Mhm.
But the premise has been proven false. When the supporters of Fairness for All approached the major gay rights organizations, 5 or 6 years ago about this, they all said no, we're not willing to give you religious exemptions for some of the reasons we were discussing before. It's almost become the point of the legislation to, as Tim Cook, the funder of a lot of the gay rights organizations, said, to punish the wicked. I mean, it really is to demonstrate that even if you're motivated by religion, it's still bad, is their perspective, right? Just like religiously motivated race discrimination is still bad. As Jim, you said a couple of times, that they don't see the distinction between the two things. So I think it was, maybe naive, and I don't mean to be critical, to expect that there would be a willingness to compromise on the other side. But regardless of that, the point is that the gay rights organizations are unwilling to compromise. They only got one small kind of marginal group to agree with this. How about folks on the other side of the political aisle? I mean, the basic breakdown in our political system, particularly at the federal level, is that Democrats support LGBT rights and SOGI laws and Republicans don't. There are more exceptions on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. But again, the idea was if Republicans step forward with a law that proposes adding SOGI as protected classes, the Democrats will respond in turn by saying, okay, what do you want? You want religious exemptions? We'll give that to you. That's not true. When this Fairness for All proposal was reduced to a bill and introduced in the House in December 2019, the reaction was overwhelmingly negative. It was consistently and exclusively negative from leading congressional Democrats. And no Democrat sponsored it. None, not one, either in the Senate or the House. Supporters of the LGBT advocacy organizations have been against religious exemptions at least since 2014 and probably since 1997, in my judgment. So I think the concern about Fairness for All is that it's hanging out there, and the impression is created that this might be a way out, that this might be the solution, that there's a grand bargain in the offing, which is less terrible than the Equality Act. And it's simply not true. This is not going to happen. It's an implausibility. And I think the problem with that is that it undermines our sense of urgency with respect to the Equality Act. A lot of time and energy has been spent trying to persuade people to support Fairness for All that could have been spent opposing the Equality Act. The other problem is that the Fairness for All proposal concedes some of the premises of the Equality Act, and therefore makes it harder to oppose the Equality Act if you're a Fairness for All supporter. The supporters of the Fairness for All, the crafters of this proposal, had two things in mind. They had religious liberty and gay rights in mind, and they neglected entirely the problems, almost entirely, to be fair, the problems that gender identity non-discrimination rules create, not for religious people, but for the common good, for women who want privacy, for doctors who don't want to be forced to perform surgeries that they're against, for young patients who are suffering from gender confusion. I mean, the Fairness for All Act requires adoption and foster agencies to treat children consistent with their supposed gender identity. That's not a good thing. So, in sum, Fairness for All is implausible. It's a bad deal. And supporting it has consequences that are not good for our fight against the Equality Act.
So then how do we fight the Equality Act? What would you suggest on practical terms that those watching or hearing this today could do?
We need to communicate with our elected representatives, especially in Washington, D.C., in a winsome and appropriate way. There's no space, there's no room for anger here. It's not helpful, although it's understandable why one would be angry about what's being proposed here and the harms that it will inflict on actual people. I think the focus of that communication has to be the harms. It has to be the harms that are imposed on women with respect to privacy and safety, on women and girls with respect to athletics. Think of the women in the homeless shelters and the Connecticut athletes. I think the medical conscience issue is important. The children suffering gender dysphoria is important. We need to communicate these downsides to legislators because they're becoming increasingly aware of this, and I think that's a good thing. There was recently a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee about the Equality Act, and so much of it focused on the harms to women in the privacy and the sports context. I think that was great. I mean, I hate to admit it, but the religious liberty arguments just aren't as persuasive as they used to be. So it behooves us to be smart, to be tactical, to be strategic, and to focus on these arguments. Now, how do you do this? Well, it's not complicated. You need to contact, particularly right now, your senators. The House has already passed this. President Biden has said he's going to sign it. I don't think he's going to change his mind. But, there's a handful of senators whose, the fate of the Equality Act is in their hands. But I think it's appropriate to communicate with all senators and express your concerns about the Equality Act. Best way is an in-person meeting. I know that's difficult in normal times. It's certainly difficult in a pandemic time. But phone calls are great. Emails are great. Visiting district or state offices or communicating with them is also great. Senators need to hear that, especially, moderate Republicans, maybe a handful of moderate Democrats. They're the ones who are going to decide the fate of this. We need to communicate with them.
Where are we with that relative, do you think, with regard to the filibuster, with regard to Senate kind of deliberations on this? What's the likelihood that this could get through the Senate as it's currently constructed, do you think?
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic that the Equality Act won't pass in the Senate. And I'm not saying that to suggest we should be complacent or dial back our efforts to oppose it. But first thing is the filibuster, the legislative filibuster that we've been hearing about so much in the news lately, because there are those who want to abolish it. Essentially requires 60 votes for most pieces of legislation, including ones like the Equality Act. So the question is, are there 60 votes for the Equality Act in the Senate right now? Answer, no. I don't think anybody thinks that there are 60 votes for it. So if the filibuster remains in place or isn't dramatically changed, I think the Equality Act can't pass this Congress, can't get 60 votes, and that's good. What about if the filibuster is abolished or changed in such a way that essentially it's abolished, if not in name, but in practicality? And then the threshold becomes 50 votes for the Equality Act. I mean, to state the obvious, the chances of the Equality Act becoming law are much higher in that circumstance. However, it's not necessarily a certainty that it would pass. You may be surprised to hear that if you're aware of the fact that there are 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans, and the Vice President Kamala Harris would break the tie. Right now, there are only 49 sure votes for the Equality Act. There are 49 Democrats, not 50, 49 Democrats who sponsored the Equality Act in the Senate and 0 Republicans. That's significant in 2 ways. Number one, where's the 50th Democrat? I thought all the Democrats supported the Equality Act. That's not correct. Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia has never been a sponsor of the Equality Act, either in the last Congress or in the Congress before. And we believe, based on good intelligence, that he has serious concerns about the Equality Act and won't vote for it in its current form. Now, we need to hold him to that and keep putting the pressure on, but that's a good sign. What about any Republicans? In the last Congress, Senator Susan Collins of Maine was a supporter and co-sponsor of the Equality Act. In this Congress, she is not. She has actually gone as far as to say, here are some changes that I would require that were I to support the Equality Act. Now that raises, there may not even be 50 votes, is the point of telling you all of that. The next question would be is there some set of compromise, not fairness for all, but is there some set of compromises where we could end up with the Equality Act that may be slightly less bad? I think that there are some Republicans who are willing to have that conversation. I mean, Senator Tom Tillis from North Carolina said that exactly in the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing 2 weeks ago, from when we're recording this. But I am convinced that the Democratic senators and the activist groups that support them are not willing to make compromises that would satisfy enough Republicans to get to 60 votes. So we'll see. But again, cautious optimism. But we're going to do this all again if it doesn't pass. We're going to do it all again in 2023 with a different Senate and a different House of Representatives. And I can't tell you what the composition is going to look like. So we have to be vigilant, not just today, but tomorrow and perhaps for years to come.
Glad you made that point, because this, as you know, has been going on for a long time. There have been versions of this that passed the House in the past and versions that have been under discussion for a very long time for a lot of the ideological reasons we're describing right now. And so first of all, we need to be praying, obviously. Need to be praying for the Lord to work in this, for God to give us wisdom and direction, and for God to change hearts. The Lord is still the Lord. He's still the King of kings and Lord of lords. And so we're praying for that. We're asking God, Lord, what can I do personally? How can I use my influence in this space? And it's exactly what Greg just said. It's reaching out directly to your representatives in the House and especially in the Senate. It's encouraging others to do the same thing. It's taking nothing for granted. If they were to abolish the filibuster or make this a special exemption to the filibuster, and you're one vote away from what we've been talking about today, that's the level of urgency that we're describing right now for us, for our churches, for our faith-based organizations, just across the gamut, across the board. But then one last thing I would add, this also gives us an opportunity to take even more seriously our call as salt and light in this culture, to be engaged not just on this issue. If your local representatives all the way up to Washington haven't already heard from you on other issues, well, that's not the way it ought to be. We ought to be engaged now. We ought to be proactive. We ought to be not only praying for our leaders, as 1 Timothy 2 says, we ought to be engaging them. We ought to be speaking into the culture, ought to be using our influence as best we can on this and on other issues as well. Greg, I've often said that I'm convinced God is calling more Christians into public service and are answering the call to those that are in leadership positions or those that are constituents of faith-based organizations right now. I would urge you to know more about the Alliance Defending Freedom. I would urge you to go to their website to see more about what it is that they do. Look for ways that you can pray for them, support them financially, partner with them, have common cause with them on various issues, make them aware of any issues you're dealing with, as they might be able to be helpful as well. And whether it's this or something else, it could be that one of the ways God's going to redeem all of this is by making ADF even more an influence in our culture, as it should be. Many that are part of this may know that ADF was part of the Hobby Lobby proceedings that led to a very significant victory for religious liberty, and has been a very important player in this space for quite a while now. I believe God redeems all he allows. That might be one way he'd redeem this as well. So, Greg, I just can't thank you enough for your time today, for what you're doing to defend us, organizations like ours, ministries like ours, churches like those that we serve, faith-based organizations like those that we serve. It's a real honor to be your partner and to walk with you and to pray for you for such a time as this, for a critical time like this. And I'm just so grateful to you for your engagement with us today.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks for everything that you do. It's indispensable.
Thank you so much, my friend. And thank you to you who are listening to this, who are watching this. I would urge you right now to stop and pray. Lord, what would you have me do now? Because of what I've heard, because of what I've seen, because of what I now know, how am I to be a custodian of this, a steward of what I now know? And how could you use my salt and light to advance your kingdom even right now? Let me urge you to pray for that. Let me lead us in prayer as we close. Father God, thank you for this time, for this conversation. I'm praying for those who right now are looking for your wisdom, your direction as regards their next steps. Give them that, Father. Speak to them, guide them, lead them, use them as your hands and feet, as your body, extending your kingdom, your ministry in earth today. I pray for Greg and for his colleagues. Bless them, use them, strengthen them, protect them, make them even more instruments to your glory. Lord, we thank you for this time, this conversation, and most of all, for your lordship, your sovereignty, and your love for us. And we make this our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.